game audio. It's one of the most important yet understated part of video games. Sound is one of the few things that actually travel from the virtual world into our concrete world. As musicians, game scores are particularly interesting since they are, at its core, a type of musical performance. One of the fundamentals for the study of game music, also known as ludomusicology, is that game scores are only ever fully realized through gameplay. So there's a divide between the soundtrack of video games and the actual score from the game. Thus, since the gamer has a hand in the actual production of sound in gameplay itself, that gameplay is a type of musical performance. Musicologist Mac Enns has gone so far as to point out that the actual sound effects and music are programmed in the exact same way. So the game score really is a total amalgamation of the sound world when actualized by the performance of the game. With this in mind, let's look at one of my favorite games, Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is the 2017 installment of the Legend of Zelda franchise. It's an open world game with a score that has clearly set itself apart from the previous Zelda games. Due to the size of the game, I'm going to narrow down our view to just the Great Plateau, just the very beginning. Despite the world being touted as open world, the beginning of the game actually limits our movement to a fairly small portion of the map, which is still actually kind of a large area to explore. I'm getting most of my game score terminology and methodology from Mac Enns' Understanding Game Scoring and Tim Summers' Understanding Video Game Music. Using these ludomusicology techniques, we can find that the underlying function of the game score at the beginning of Breath of the Wild is to condition the player for the narrative space and the expected gameplay behavior for the rest of the game. But before we get into that directly, we need to figure out how to hear a game score. At the end of Tim Summers' book, he includes an outline of how to hear a video game, which is modeled after early film music research. One of the first things that I took away from this is actually at the end. I needed to create a profile for the game, so I outlined every single cue in the Great Plateau. Then I went back and chose some key questions that helped answer how the beginning score prepares us for the game, particularly ones about the relationship between the narrative genre and the musical genre, the gameplay style and the musical genre, the use and non-use of music in the game, ludic function, and musical slippage, which is talking about diegetic and non-diegetic blurring. I know that sounds like a lot, so let's first look at a simple area of the game where music keys us in on a fourth wall break or a slight perspective shift in a certain part of the game. Some of the music and sound effects that we do not think about as much is the music surrounding the UI, the user interface. For example, there are button clicks, transitions from the menu, and movement throughout the menu. However, there is one area where the supposed diegesis is blurred a little bit. Basically, the assumption is that the UI sounds are so-called non-diegetic, as in Link, the character in the game, cannot hear them. However, watch as we open the left menu. Hear that sound? That sound shows up when the Sheikah Slate turns on for the very first time in the game. We get a little cutscene the first time we pull out the map, but after that it goes straight to the map, which lulls us into this false sense of being outside the diegetic space, when in fact the game has temporarily moved us into a first-person perspective of Link looking through the slate. This almost seems to break the fourth wall, or at least blurs the lines as to what is diegetic and non-diegetic. This is a very surface level observation, but we can nail down the current game state and perspective in this moment simply due to the sound effects. It is also very interesting to note that the pitch is important in the Sheikah Slate menu and less important in the other parts of the non-diegetic menu. So if the sound effects can tell us about the game state, how does the music inform our gameplay? One of the first things we note about almost any open world game is that they are often inherently violent. Indeed, the first item we find in the world is a weapon, and we meet villains very soon and very often. As with many games, the game state change into battle mode changes the music as well, so let's first listen to the soundtrack version, and then see how it triggers in game. And now in game. As we can hear, the instruments come in one by one, which smooths out the entrance of the music. The music is rhythmic but off-kilter, which describes the kind of percussive yet improvisatory style of the fight. The level of the music is louder than most of the ambient music and changes volume depending on how close you are to your enemy. Finally, the game shows that the music only plays when the enemy notices you, not just when you start fighting. This helps us identify when the enemy is not just near, but aware, and causes us to either fight or flight. Due to the dynamic nature of the cue, it can lead to some interesting musical performances. The question is, are the developers encouraging us or discouraging us to fight? The music is scary, and so if we run or quickly dispatch of the enemies, it never fully comes into view and the instruments never fully come in, so we kind of suppress it. In that sense, the developers want us to at least efficiently fight or run. The only time that there's a major exception to this where it's not as scary and we get some sort of musical reward is in a camp setting where we actually win a chest if we defeat all the enemies. Overall, the battle music tells us that the world has enemies in it, but the environmental music draws us closer to the actual narrative and gameplay currents running underneath the entire game. As you can see, there are only a handful of what I consider longer musical cues. Summers talks about the idea that the music can add extra meaning to the physical aspects of a virtual world in a concept that he calls texturing. So, for example, let's listen to the music where we stand in a generic field, kind of the default music when we're just wandering around the world, often known as overworld music. And then in the gameplay, it sounds more like this. I know this is only a short portion of it, but I can guarantee you that if you walk onto any of the generic fields in Hyrule and around with no other villages and just out in the middle of nowhere, it sounds mostly empty. There is very little music. The space in that kind of emphasizes this as a space in the world, and you notice that the only sounds from the score come from the sound effects and stingers when we interact with the environment. This tells us that the game developers encourage foraging, discovery, and demands that we explore and interact with the world to actually get some satisfying soundtrack. However, if we look at the other locations in Breath of the Wild, we notice a slightly different pattern that emerges. With the tower music and the shrine music, we hear more consistent rhythms, emphasis on texture, wall-to-wall music, and then finally, and most importantly, electronics. This use of electronics signals an ongoing theme throughout the game about nature versus machine that other musicologists have definitely talked about in length. I'll link to that below. The winter music signals to us that there's something slightly off about this terrain. It's not an immediate danger like the battle music, but it's not safe either. We could die of the cold. It's a subtle texturing, but we see the same thing happen later in the game when it comes to the desert and the volcano locations. Not immediate danger, but still dangerous. Finally, we arrive at the most melodically driven track. The Temple of Time is an important area where we receive considerable narrative burst into the rest of the game. It is where we receive our first physical power-ups. The location itself is a remnant from the long-lost kingdom of Hyrule, and it is a real-life callback since the melody of this theme is from a previous game. As we will see throughout the game, there are many, many Easter eggs, both musically and in-game, that remind us that this is not the first Legend of Zelda game. But in the actual narrative of the game itself, this isn't the first time that they've had to fight Ganon. So the legend works on a both narrative level and in real life level. Each of these examples shows us there is something either subtle or not subtle about the environments that sets it apart from the default landscape. And it looks forward to the rest of the game, where we have more hazardous environments, locations that show the dangers and benefits of technology versus nature, and locations that harken back to the legacy of the game. Hazardous environments, dangerous tech, legacy, surely there's somewhere in the game where all these things converge in the score. In the endgame of Breath of the Wild, we finally arrive at Hyrule Castle to kill Calamity Ganon once and for all. In classic Zelda style, we are met with an environment that we must navigate very carefully. If you listen closely, you can hear each of the previously mentioned narrative properties actually in the score at the same time. First, we notice that we are met with a militant and ominous rendition of the classic overworld theme from previous Legend of Zelda games. This is in the exterior part of the castle. In the interior, we hear Zelda's lullaby. We are so close to fulfilling the prophecy, so close to Zelda herself, and the connection to the past is also clear as ever in the music. Now, technically, there are no electronics in the score. However, the piano line seems lifted from the Guardian's battle music. The score, sound effects included, often also have the beeping from the Guardians. Since the music doesn't change when Guardians are aware of us, it signifies that the entire environment is unsafe, as opposed to earlier in the game where it changes when the Guardians notice us. We even get the sounds of Malice, which is Ganon's corruption of the environment, also in the score. Though those last two are sound effects that are part of the game itself, they are like wall-to-wall music and combine very well with the actual music of the game. This tells us the true story of the ending, where we have environmental troubles, where we have constant struggles with technology, but we are also very close to the legacy of the past. The combination of these three elements are actually telegraphed from the very beginning of the Great Plateau. The game score in that beginning truly prepares us for the final part of the game, where we musically see the themes of the Breath of the Wild realized all at once.